There's a wonderful contradiction between the Britain of the sort of early 1970s and the Britain of the late 1960s. There's an excitement. Here he is at Snape, at the concert hall at Snape. There's a real excitement in this new venture that he's undertaken, notwithstanding that the concert hall burnt down at the opening of the 1969 festival. They had it open again in time for the 1970 festival. And here you have some of the kids of the Wandsworth Choir who were singing they were singing the Children's Crusade. Now, the Children's Crusade is an incredibly bleak and dystopic picture of a Brecht poem. And it's this idea of these children who are, by this stage, orphaned in the war. And there are no adults left. This is sort of the community of children. And they go off searching for hope. And they capture a dog at one stage. And in the course of this poem, they almost become the adults and enact sort of adult rituals. And so, for instance, a child dies, and so they bury him as best they can. There are the fights between the varying camps within this sort of community of children. There's the determination that one would end up a leader. There's another one that wants to be. And then ultimately, you're left with this picture of just a single dog. The dog with a little note round its neck, wandering, saying, we're lost, we're the band of children and we're lost. And so presumably by then all the children have died, and the only survivor is this mangy, very, very thin dog. Britten, of course, was intrigued by this idea of childhood being taken away from children before time. And on a tour to Australia in 1970, in the spring of 1970, where he toured around what was then called Ayers Rock, now known as Uluru, the indigenous name, with the painter Sidney Nolan and his wife Cynthia. And I once asked Nolan's biographer, Tom Rosenthal, about the couple, and he said that if Britten could display extraordinary good feelings towards Cynthia Nolan, he was a man of great tact and talent. Because she said she was a complete monster. I don't know, that's the biographer speaking, and you must never trust them. So Nolan in this period decided to do his own artistic depictions of the Children's Crusade, and they are amazingly bleak and black and rather touching pictures as well. The last one being the one of the dog with the little note saying, the dog knows its way. So Britten, on this trip, sort of talks about the possible artistic ideas and what he wants to do with the festival, and confesses to Nolan that he thinks that he'll just die in the harness, and that's what he is. And this whole idea of being in Australia and in the Australian outback, which he found idyllic, was to him sort of an impossible land, and that he was to come back and, of course, run his festival. The interesting thing also about the two Britons, if you like, is that it was being picked up by critics at the time, and not just in the way he looked, but in the music he was writing. And so you have people starting to say, well, those of you that were scared about the sort of the increasingly bleak music that Britten is writing in the 1960s, you can be rest assured, in 1966 with this new cycle, he has some of his old style and spirit back. But what you also see at Snape Maltings in footage in 1970, when they reopen it after just a year after it had burned down, you see a very, very ill Benjamin Britten, and this is sort of, to my mind, the two Britons is the difference between illness and good health. And it seems to happen in a very short space of time. If you look at photographs up until about 1968, he looks exactly as he's always looked, this very healthy young man. And in 1970, conducting scenes from Gloriana in the reopening of the St. Maltings, he's become incredibly bloated. His hair is now completely grey. He sweats. He's sort of staring into his score of his own music as he conducts it, and looks exhausted by what he's been just conducting, which is the final scene of Gloriana, a very sort of poignant return to a work that had continued to haunt him since its failure in 1953. This is him. This is sort of the well Britten, but even at this stage, you can see him sort of filling out, becoming a rather different creature from the very sort of thin and spindly person he was in the 1960s. Very rare photo of him and Piers actually playing duets. It's something they tended to do only as a sort of their escape, the thing that they like to do for their own entertainment and their own sort of domestic situation. Here, obviously, in probably a fundraiser, I'd say, for yet more money needed for the Maltings. But what happens also in 1970 is he writes this piece, which I call a pivotal piece in the transition, if you like, between the two Britons. On the one hand, the Briton writing this rather austere music in the 1960s, a well man, to a Briton writing rather vibrant, incredible music in the 1970s, a very sick man. And the piece that does that transition, if you like, is the opera Owen Wingrave, which he writes for television, and it's commissioned by the BBC. And he chooses the subject because he feels as though after this decade of rather austere works, and also his withdrawal, if you like, into the community at Aldeburgh and to the new concert hall at Snape, he wants to write something that he thinks will have an enormous impact, and of course on a subject that is very, very close to his heart, and that's the idea of pacifism. And so the story of Owen Wingrave, as many of you would know, which is another Henry James novella, much along the lines of the Turn of the Screw, is about a young man at a military academy from a very, very large and prestigious military family, who decides at about the age of 18 that he doesn't want to be part of the war machine, and then has to go home and tell his fiancée, his fiancée's mother, and his grandfather of his decision. And of course the grandfather, played by Piers, disinherits the boy, and the mother of his fiancée, who's a pretty frightful character, as is the fiancée, when it comes down to it, they both goad him and about his decision, and then the fiancée goads him because she says it's a symbol of cowardice, and whereas of course it's actually anything but to come and face up a family like this and tell them of this decision. So she goads him into staying the night in the haunted room in the house, and we only find out that the haunted room is haunted, or so in fable is haunted, because of a generation or 3 generations ago, a father had hit his son and hit him so hard that he'd killed him. And so this is this monstrous family that Owen's trying to get out of, really. And of course, what happens is, to appease his fiancée, he sleeps the night in the room, but then she has a change of heart, and in the middle of the night goes down, opens the door, and he's dead. And a bit like the Turn of the Screw, as you remember, there's no real explanation for why he died, and all you have is the family then rehearsing their grief for their own actions, for Owen's decision, and that's how the opera ends. It's an unsatisfactory ending. It sort of builds and builds and builds, a bit like that in Turn of the Screw, but then it just sort of fizzles, and it doesn't have the sort of impact of Turn of the Screw. But that shouldn't take away from the fact that it's a really extraordinary score, and he has some of the things that he'd been experimenting with since the early 50s, in the mid-50s, so that the ideas of gamelan music and the really, really careful writing for percussion. But it seems to jump back and miss all this sort of austere music of the 1960s and tap into a far more opulent sense of what music and opera was that Britten sort of displayed in the sort of the mid-40s to the early 50s, if you like, before the Gloriana debacle made him withdraw more and more into himself. So it's an unfairly neglected work, that's for certain, and it suffered also from a not very good production. The first filmed production was very sort of cramped, and then when it went to Covent Garden, it wasn't much better. So it's one of those stillbirth operas, and that I'm optimistic that it will eventually take its place in the canon, or at least on the outsides of the canon. The reason we're not performing any music from it is that the major work is, or the major arias and the major part is for baritone. And that the writing for Peter Piers's character, the grandfather, is really ungrateful writing. It's Colin Matthews, Britten's assistant at this time, thought that he was almost parodying some of Piers's vocal mannerisms in writing for this character. And for me, that seems a little unnecessarily cruel, but it's certainly possible. But what it does is, straight away, after the church parables and the sort of pared down palette, if you like, of the 1960s, you have Britten engaging with grand opera once more, even if it's on a slightly smaller scale than Billy Budd or Peter Grimes or something like that. And straight away he decides that there's one more thing he wants to write, one more role for Piers, an incredibly grateful one after the ungrateful writing in Owen Wingrave. He wants to write for himself because he has this feeling now that he's incredibly unwell. And his doctor at this stage, in around 1971, says, okay, we want you to go and see a heart specialist. And Britten says, no, I have this one idea for an opera. And it's an opera based on a piece, a story that he'd been thinking about for a long time, which is Thomas Mann's Death in Venice. Now, everyone in the Aldborough circle, when they heard this, just sort of went, oh no, please don't tackle this story. And for those of you that don't know it, of course, it's the story of an aging writer, but actually in the Mann he's only about 46, who feels that he's run out of inspiration, and instead of going to the mountains as he normally does in the summer, he goes to Venice. And in Venice, where he thinks he'll find his inspiration, he there falls in love or infatuation with a teenage boy, and then becomes completely obsessed by him, and feels as though he's the key, not just to sort of an emotional enlightenment, if you like. He had been previously married and now widowed, but also that this boy is somehow the key to his continued creativity or re-sparked creativity. And then when he reads about warnings in the paper about a cholera epidemic, and they're denied by the hotel people, etc., he decides to leave, but then decides to come back and stay there and pursue this boy even further. And then finally, at the end of the opera, you have him being beckoned to by the Taju, this beautiful boy, and he gets to sort of stand in his deck chair at the sea because he feels as though, this is now finally the signal that the boy wants him. But he then slumps dead in his chair, dead of cholera, and you realize then at that moment that the boy is probably Hermes, the god, taking him from one world to the next. So it's a desperately sad story, and but it's skated very, very close to some of the infatuations in Britten's own life, and that's why people thought it was a very dangerous opera for him to write. It, like Owen Wingrave, is full of really vibrant and brilliant music. And even though you have Peter Pears at this stage saying to Sidney Nolan, Ben's writing this terrible opera and it's killing him, and even though you have this threat of some sort of surgery hanging over Britten, and this sense of illness and just this desperation and tiredness, this inability to walk upstairs without even having to stop halfway up the landing, inability to play tennis anymore, all of these things that he'd done so easily and fluently as a young man, all of this is hanging over him, but still he writes this music of great vitality and incredible brio. And it deals very sensitively, but skating very, very close to the edge of some of these obsessions that Britten had all his life, namely whether it's possible to have platonic love of a young pre-adolescent boy, whether creativity is tied up with with the notion of love, whether order or chaos should actually govern a composer or an artist in his or her life, whether Dionysian urges should give way to Apollonian order, and this is something that Britten had been thinking about for a very long time, and comes across in one of the most famous arias, very, very still aria towards the end of the opera, where Aschenbach recreates the conversation between Socrates and Phaedre, which we'll perform for you now.
Does beauty lead to wisdom, Phaedre? Yes, but through the senses. Can poets take this way then? For senses lead to passion, Phaedre. Passion leads to knowledge, knowledge to forgiveness, to compassion with the abyss. Should we then reject it, Phaedre? Wisdom poets crave, seeking only form and pure detachment. Simplicity and discipline, but this is beauty, Phaedre. Discovered through the senses, and senses lead to passion, Phaedre. And passion to the abyss. And now, Phaedre, I will go, but you stay here, and when your eyes no longer see me, then you go too.
It's so much the Auden and Britten of 1941. Remember the letter that Auden wrote to Britten in 1942, just before he goes back to England from America. Goodness and beauty are the results of a perfect balance between order and chaos, bohemianism and bourgeois convention. Bohemian chaos alone ends in a mad jumble of beautiful scraps. Bourgeois convention alone ends in large, unfeeling corpses. Your attraction to thin as a board juveniles, i.e. to the senseless and innocent, is a symptom of this. And I'm certain too that it is your denial and evasion of the demands of disorder that is responsible for your attacks of ill health, i.e. sickness is your substitute for the bohemian. It's an amazing idea that this was planted into Britten's head in 1942. and then just sort of percolates there for 30 years, over 30 years, and then comes out so emphatically in this piece. And you see it even in the urgency of his sketching. This is on a trip to Venice, where he comes up with this so-called Serenissima theme, and Serenissima is the historical name or ahistorical name for Venice, and where he sort of sketches in this book madly, goes around the streets of Venice, finds gondoliers who will give their calls to him, and he notates them down, listens to the bells clanging around. He's so sort of obsessed with this idea, and brings it across into the sort of breathless urgency of the piece. If you look at the opening of his manuscript to it, it's Aschenbach is walking through the streets of Munich on a spring evening. But it has this incredibly sort of, repetitive ostinato that is almost his heartbeat at the same time as it is his sort of restlessness. So you have something very contemporary about it, but you also have, you have something very 1940s about it, but you also have something very contemporary. And the 1940s-ness is suggested in, actually I'll get to that. He also returned to the idea of Mahler in this piece, perhaps more than he had before. Don't forget at this stage the film Death in Venice was being made by Visconti. Now Britten was advised by his lawyers not to watch it, so that there was no sense that he'd borrowed from it. But of course the figure in there, or the tragic figure in that, is Mahler. And certainly Mahler's music is used to such a great extent. But it's really amazing as well that even though Britten chose not to see the Visconti, there are such strong threads of Mahler in his own writing, not least of all the moment after Aschenbach dies. And it's at this moment that the orchestra plays a postlude, which lasts about 90 seconds or something, and it combines this Mahlerian spirit that Britten has with the sound world that's attached to the boy, the beautiful boy Tadzio. And it's some of the most, even though Aschenbach's now slumped dead in his seat, it is some of the most beautiful and touching music that Britten wrote in his entire career. The 1940s aspect of it is underlined. This is the first stage production at Snape. I was at a concert just the other day, and and sitting next to someone who said, oh, my name is Stephen Terry. And I said, no way. And Stephen Terry was the first Puck in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And it would be rather like, running into this rather wonderful dancer at the time. The connection I find at this stage is really jumping over the sort of 1960s, jumping back into the music of the very early 1950s and also the 1940s. And for those of you that wondered why I would have left out one of Britten's most famous pieces in the first lecture, it's because I feel as though it works as a real counterpoint here to the music of the 1970s, this final period of his where he was reinventing himself with great vitality after a fairly dour decade, it had to be said. So here it is in its triadic, its use of triads, which fascinated him as a boy, and as you could hear in that little Phaedre monologue, was fascinating him again as an older man. But here it is, the use of the triad in all its beauty in the Keats sonnet from the Serenade for tenor, horn and strings.
Darkness burrowing like a mole.
Queen Mother, quite a close friend of Britten's, responded to the extraordinarily slow recovery that Britten experienced from the heart operation in 1973. It was thought that he would make a complete recovery, and certainly when he went into surgery, he'd been told by his heart specialist, Graham Haywood, that he would make a recovery and that he'd be back conducting, and all the things that he found incredibly difficult in the last years of his life before the operation. In November 1974, he's with his really wonderful and supportive nurse, Rita Thompson, and turns to her and says, "I'm not going to get better, am I?" And she says, no, you're not. And this is a year and a half after surgery. And she says, some people will tire you out, some people will love you, some people will make you feel better, some people will make you feel worse. And it was at that moment that Britten decided, well, I really am very short of time, and I'm going to use this time as best I can. Now, he does that in a number of ways. He can't reach up to the top of large manuscript paper anymore, so he has to work very closely with his assistants, whether they be Rosamond Strode or Colin Matthews. He can't shave in the morning. He needs help getting dressed. He doesn't come down really from bed until about 11 in the morning. But then slowly he tries to get back into a semblance of his pre-operation self, and a semblance of his composing self, this artist that he'd been for 50 years or more. And so he revisits some old works. And his publisher at this stage, Donald Mitchell, had been instrumental in sort of fishing out some of the old works that he had confined to his desk of horrors or trunk of horrors, and looked at them. Now, there are two things at play here. The first is this idea that music that this young man had written and then discarded had come so effortlessly to him. And he was sort of so cross with himself and so pleased with himself simultaneously that what was so effortless then was now such a monumental struggle. But he did. He looked at some of these early string quartets. He looked at some of the early songs and started sort of saying, well, actually, I was rather clever at that stage. And he revisits the idea of folk songs. He can no longer play the piano because of the heart operation and the stroke he suffers. And so he starts writing ever more for Piers as an ensemble with the harpist Ossian Ellis. And the thinking there is, if he can't play the piano, there's damn no chance that he's going to give it to someone else to play the piano. So he writes for harp instead. And people do sort of rally around him as he tries to cope with this sickness and infirmity. And not least of all, the Queen Mother. Here she is as patron. They ask her to be patron of the Aubras Festival. And Britten looking rather good. This is in 1975, welcoming her to lunch at the Red House. And Piers looking like the grand patrician that he was. So this is healthy Britain and looking good on it. And she had commissioned him as a way of helping him to start writing original music again. And so this is one of the pieces that he wrote for Ossian Ellis and for Peter Piers. And it was to celebrate her birthday. And even though it sounds very much like a folk melody, and folk music was occupying him a little more in this period as a way of helping him to get back into the art of composing, these are original works. And this is one of a cycle called The Winter.
Very sad. are blessed, and their little hearts at rest. But my true love is parted from me. But my true love is parted from me.
One of the works he was completely hesitant about revisiting, but gradually in the 1970s, as his health worsened, and then ultimately when the poet himself died, he revisited Paul Bunyan, the operetta that he'd written with Auden in 1941. It was something that he almost couldn't go back to while Auden was alive. The memories of the collaboration and the memories of their breakdown in their friendship weighed incredibly heavily on him. And when he heard about Auden's death in '73, he broke down crying straight away and worried about how he could be so stubborn and how Britten could be so stubborn and throw away such a valued relationship. And so he decided to fish out, at Peter Piers's encouragement, Paul Bunyan. And they sort of did little excerpts very informally. Then they did something a little more extensive. Then they broadcast little bits of it. And each time, Britten sort of tinkered with it. And then finally they decided to mount a complete performance of it in 1975. And Britten was overwhelmed by this, by the vitality of the music, by the memories he had of this great friend of his who had died. And you can tell, I mean, we did the Inkslinger aria, but we'll just recapitulate a tiny little bit of it to give you an idea of what it was that so encouraged him in the context of the death of this very great man who hectored him and who helped turn him into the artist that he was.
out of men's faces, and all get sufficient to eat.
Emboldened by such rehabilitations and by his engagement with poetry, he hears Janet Baker singing some Berlioz and decides to write a cantata for her. Writes it in extremely short space of time. He hears her in 1975 in the June, immediately sits down, selects the poetry in translation by Lowell, and it's Racine's Phaedre, and sets it in the space of a matter of a month. And then in 1976 invites her to the festival to give the first performance. And so you have Colin Matthews in the background there, in a photograph you'd probably prefer I didn't display. Janet Baker, of course. Britten, this incredible concentration. This is, again, the two Brittons. You would have him this really fierce, concentrated mind, or you'd have this sort of slightly enfeebled, droopy man. And then Rita Thompson, his nurse, just there, which I like to think of this guardian angel. And she sort of gives this performance of this incredible piece that's about the Phaedre who falls in love with her stepson, basically, and then tries to pretend when he rejects her that it was all his idea, and so the father of the stepson, Phaedre's husband, orders his death. Now you miss a lot of this in the contraction, but again it's an incredibly skillful contraction. Reminds me very much of the contraction that Piers and Britten did on Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. And you get this just sort of monologue which finishes with Janet Baker standing there, or Phaedre standing there, saying, I absolve your son, he didn't actually do it, it was all me, and I have taken poison, Medea's poison darts through my veins. And then the music just sort of winds to a halt as the heartbeat of Phaedre sort of gives way to nothing. It's incredibly powerful music. And again, a piece that I like to think of as testimony to this period of vitality in Britten's music. I think because he was so ill, something we'll get on to next, a lot of people have found, a lot of people have said over the years that this music was sort of very weak as well. Now it is true in the 1960s, the late 1960s, there was a sort of feebleness to it, to some of the music. And Colin Matthews says, for instance, that it must have been evident to Britten, even himself, in the late 1960s that he was going over a lot of old ground and that he wasn't actually embarking on really new stuff. But what happens then is people don't recognise that this music of the 1970s, this period of 5 years, including this extraordinary cantata, is music of great vitality. It's caught up in the narrative of decline involving Britten's own health. And people sort of feel as though because he's so unwell, the music itself is sort of lacking in strength, and that's not the case. The health, Britain's health, I'm going the wrong way, sorry. Sorry, just before Britain's health, the final piece that sort of Britten was working on, again with this great sense of urgency that time was short, was a string quartet, his first string quartet since 1945. And here we are in November 1975, 30 years later, in Venice, where he goes for the last time. He comes up with all sorts of reasons why he can't go. He doesn't feel well enough. The flying's too difficult. What will he be able to do? He's confined to a wheelchair. But Rita Thompson, who is probably behind him there, overcome all of his objections, or each of his objections, and finally they go in November to Venice for the final time, a city that has had such a large and strong impact on him all his life. And it's here he sort of makes lots more sketching for the string quartet, for the Amadeus Quartet. this itself is a work of hypnotic beauty and great vibrancy. It sort of leapfrogs as well the 1960s, these austere pared down works, to the much more opulent string writing of the 1940s, his previous numbered string quartet. And in June, this is June 1976, he's made Lord Britten of Aldborough, the borough of Aldborough. This is the small garden party, but he's still working on this this sketch of this string quartet for the Amadeus Quartet. This also is June. Because of the stance he took on Solzhenitsyn, Mstislav Rostropovich had been not allowed to travel. So he had missed Britten's decline in health. And here's their first reunion after the ban on his travel had been lifted. And I think he's greeting Galina Vishnevskaya, with Rostropovich looking on, and an incredibly moved Peter Pears watching this reunion. And Rostropovich later saying he couldn't believe how frail this man was, you know, and in such a short space of time. A lot of people at the premiere of Phaedre said the same thing. How could this man, standing in the box, gingerly and totteringly taking applause for this vibrant and visceral cantata, how could they be the same people, the composer and this man there? And you sort of read all this on everyone's faces there, the sadness of this life drawing to a close, and drawing to a close very quickly. That's this letter, because I do have to address something about his health, but this is a letter he wrote to Peter Pears when Pears was in America doing the first performance of Death in Venice in 1974. My darling heart, perhaps an unfortunate phrase, but I can't use any other. And it's this amazing love letter. So it's worth remembering, especially because of some of the things that have been said in the last month since my book came out, that this was a bond of great substance and of lasting substance. But it has to be talked about that the surgeon, when operating on Britten, encountered something that he didn't quite understand in surgery, and looked at it, and it didn't quite add up. But he went forward with the procedure, and the procedure, which was to put in an autograft, a human graft, in place of the aorta, which had been showing signs of incompetence. But then subsequent to that, or in surgery, took biopsies of the aorta and of parts of the heart, and then sewed him back up, and everyone went on their way. And this, of course, was the time when they thought Britten would be better. But in the space of somewhere between a year and 2 years, the surgeon worked on the biopsy and determined that all the symptoms added up to one thing, and that was that the aorta was damaged by syphilis, and that the cardiac incompetence was caused by syphilis. And he wrote about this. We now know more than even when I wrote the book, because the surgical records weren't available, and they now are. And he wrote about this in his surgical report, which was, the etiology of this valve lesion is not clear to me, and certainly not characteristic of bacterial endocarditis, nor was the valve of bicuspid structure, which would suggest a congenital valve. So this was always the problem. You know, he'd been told for such a long time that he had had a congenitally poor heart, and here's the surgeon saying, "Well, no, that's not the case." And indeed, the endocarditis for which he was treated in 1968, and given huge amounts of penicillin, there was no sign that actually he had ever suffered from endocarditis. A few years later, Donald Ross, the surgeon, the third name there of this co-authored piece, wrote about the instances of syphilis that he had encountered in surgery at the National Heart Hospital over 30 years. And all of those patients, except for one, case 4, had shown signs of this beforehand. And this was completely unknown to the surgeon at the time of surgery. And you see the date there, the 17th of the 5th, 73. That's just 10 days after the Britten operation. And so the surgeon then, of course, confided in a cardiologist who was the source for my allegations, or my diagnosis in my book, and he's now read all the surgical material and says that he's absolutely certain that case 4 is a disguised Benjamin Britten. Because he was such a prominent patient, and the date of his surgery was known, that if the age was given correctly and the date was given correctly, the anonymity would be removed. So I just wanted to address that. It's to me a great sadness because it's a very sort of 20th century phenomenon, and by the mid of the 20th century, of course, penicillin had more or less given away, had eradicated it, and so what we're dealing here is a very, very tragic circumstance of, I think, symptoms being missed in 1940 when Britain was very, very ill, and not being given the right treatment then, which would have cost a couple of bucks. And this very healthy man, the whole of his life, would have kept on composing. To finish, we'd like to perform out of period, but this amazing sort of artistic statement of Britten's whole composing life, which is from the Hardy setting that he made in 1953, and it's called Before Life and After, taken from his song cycle Winter Words.
Testimonies tell before the birth of consciousness, when all went well, none suffered sickness, love, or loss, none knew regret, starved hope, or heart-burnings, none cared whatever crash or cross protract to things. If something ceased, no tongue bewailed. If something winced and waned, no heart was wrung. If brightness dimmed and dark prevailed, no sense was done, but the disease of feeling germed, and primal rightness took the tinct of wrong, and nescient shadow